Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Cornerstone Institute. My name is Zizi Pokyupeni, and I will be your host for this evening's dialogue. We're here for Critical Dialogues, and the subject matter tonight is the impact of textbook piracy in the higher education sector. We have a distinguished panel that is going to share their expertise and their experiences of the ramifications that come with the challenge presented by textbook piracy. Our program this evening promises to be engaging and enlightening. So without further ado, I'd love for us to delve into why we're here tonight. Our esteemed panel is comprised of members of the academic fraternity, the publishing industry, as well as student representatives who are going to help us unravel the intricacies of textbook piracy, identify key influences, and more significantly, explore strategies that work towards the preservation of educational content integrity. And so I ask of you to join us, willfully engage, participate virtually as well. So before we get started, I'd just like to run through some house rules. Our restrooms are on the right exit of the auditorium, if and when you should need to, step out. And in the event that you do, I kindly ask that you wait for the intervals where we're switching up panelists, just to enable lower levels of disturbance throughout the dialogue. We'd also appreciate it if your cell phones were on silent for the duration of the dialogue, and we encourage online interaction. Our official hashtag for tonight is CI Critical Dialogues 23. We will be live tweeting and live threading on Instagram. So we encourage the participation online. I'd also like to acknowledge our viewers and audiences that are dialing in from our Facebook Live. We have some interactive ways of engagement today. So in terms of us connecting with you guys as an audience, we have Slido. You are more than welcome to access the Slido tool via the Slido website with our code hashtag 2387454. That is 2387454. And that will allow you to push through your questions throughout the evening as a means to engage, contribute to the dialogue, and ask stimulating questions. Once again, welcome to Cornerstone Institute. And it is with that said that I'd love to ask Janine Ludolf to join me on the stage. Janine is Publishing Manager, Higher Education at Oxford University Press. She holds multiple qualifications, including a BA in a Bachelor of Arts, PGCE, Masters in English Literature from the University of Stellenbosch. Janine is a publishing manager, like I said. She has extensive experience in strategic development and the delivery of robust market-facing print and digital products, particularly within the higher education space. This includes conceptualizing, curating, and commissioning content, all with a sharp editorial eye. She is passionate about education and lifelong learning, and as such, takes pleasure and pride in developing learning and teaching materials. Janine, welcome. Alrighty, is your mic on?
Yes.
Is it good?
Seems good.
All right, Janine, from the perspective of the publisher, I think it would be best to start around what has your experience been in terms of developing teaching and learning materials for higher education, and how has textbook piracy affected your ability to do that in a qualitative, sustainable way?
Thanks, Zizi. So I've been in publishing for 15 years now, and we've definitely noticed an increase in piracy in the last few years. it's a massive threat to the textbook industry, but it also goes beyond that. It's going to affect the entire higher education ecosystem. In my role as product manager, we've noticed a decline in unit sales. And it's also true for other publishers as well. This isn't just an Oxford University Press Southern Africa problem. Yet students clearly want textbooks. So we've done a lot of research, we've run focus groups, and we know that students have pirated copies. They're disseminating PDFs, Word files on Telegram and WhatsApp and so on. That leads us to kind of draw three conclusions. Firstly, students are obviously hungry for content, be it prescribed by their lecturers or not. They have access to content and they want it. They either don't know about the fact that piracy is an illegal act, or they're actually so desperate and hungry for content that they're willing to ignore that risk. Just going to look at my notes.
Okay.
I think one of the things that students also do is they kind of, in that desperation for content, feel like it's just me. I'm just sharing one book. It's nothing major. I just want to pass. And we need to address that attitude as well.
What are some of the other contributing factors? So you mentioned one that affects essentially the end user, or where rather the end user is making a decision not to engage the product, the actual textbook at its price point, but is doing it through piracy, right? What are the surrounding factors around that, specifically when it comes to the distribution of textbooks within the higher education space? What's gone wrong there that has amplified or exacerbated how textbook piracy has become what it is now in terms of a risk within the publishing sector?
Sure, there's a lot to unpack there, Zizi. I think that in South Africa there's a massive need for education, particularly at higher education spaces. And it's important that we have content which is accessible for students and that it's affordable. I mean, we live in a very volatile and challenging socioeconomic context, and we know that funding is a massive issue at a personal level, at an institutional level. So we need to find ways to address that funding model as well. And I think the way to do that is we need to involve all stakeholders. But I feel like there isn't an understanding of how big the problem is necessarily. I think there's a perception that this is a commercial publishing problem, but it's not. The more piracy impacts publishers, it means that there's less funding in the system, there's less financial viability. It means less content is going to be produced essentially. It's going to drive pricing up, which is passed on to the end user. It's going to affect whether authors want to actually write books. It's also going to mean that if authors aren't writing books, that there isn't a dissemination of knowledge. And that's particularly important in the African context, where we need to make sure that we are producing content that's relevant for our local context.
I hear you. As a publishing manager, what measures have you taken to make legitimate digital alternatives more accessible to students in an effort to reduce the intensity, or rather the incentive for piracy?
So there's a couple of things which we've been doing, both at a company level and more broadly than that. So we have a platform which can integrate into learning management systems, and this means that we can also deliver content more easily to institutions. And if we have a partnership with that institution, which is something we're actively pursuing, it also means that there's licensing models where we can put content directly onto an LMS platform. And it gives us economies of scale then as well. We can negotiate discounts around pricing, and it also creates an equilibrium where all students have access to the content. We do also make sure that our digital content, particularly ebooks, have digital rights management embedded in them, DRM. And the other thing that we've done is we've also tried to raise awareness around the issue of piracy. And I think there's definitely a lack of what's happening in that space. It's very evident when you go on campus, when you speak to lecturers as well, that not everyone knows what piracy is. They kind of think it only applies to movies, when that's not the case. And they don't always realize that it has implications.
Do you think that as publishers who distribute, essential content around education, that there's an opportunity to do more educational work in terms of conscientizing students and all the stakeholders that are affected by textbook piracy around the impacts and implications of it? That's part one of my question. The second is, what have been some of the definitive bottlenecks in terms of engaging higher education institutions to somewhat streamline content access for the purposes of protecting educational content and preserving its integrity?
I might ask you to repeat the second part of the question. The first part of the question, just to talk about what we've been doing to conscientize. So we work quite closely with the Publishing Association of South Africa. I sit on their academic board, and I've got colleagues who also sit on the legal sector board. And we have done a couple of things. We've launched a campaign to highlight awareness around piracy. We have also sent out communication to senior management at universities to kind of highlight the fact that this is an issue on their campus and that they need to work with us to overcome that. And as a publisher as well, we're also putting anti-piracy messages in our product as well, just to raise awareness about this.
I've got you.
What's the second question again?
The second question was, what definitive bottlenecks are you experiencing from the publishing side of things in terms of engaging institutions to streamline how educational content is accessed with the intention to minimize the incentivizing of piracy?
Sure. I think that one of the major factors or bottlenecks, as you call it, is at institutions there's so much that is happening right now. Higher education is a really volatile space with many challenges. And I think that this, unfortunately and wrongly, has fallen alongside and is on the back burner. I think there's also quite a lack of education as well around it. I think we should be talking about piracy right alongside plagiarism, because essentially both of those are the theft of someone's intellectual property. So I think that's one of the major bottlenecks. And then in terms of distribution, I think also, like I mentioned, we have a platform earlier. I think one of the challenges as well is that there's a lot of institutions which are really hungry to go digital and do more, but there's also a lack of knowledge about how to implement it. So it was quite interesting listening to Glenda earlier talk about how there are bodies at universities which kind of assist lecturers in doing that, in going digital and offering hybrid models and so on. And I think we need more of that.
This is a really good segue to invite Dr. Glenda Cox to join us. And I think it's particularly because when it comes to digital integration, you start to think about education and educational access in the context of South Africa and what that means in terms of it being an equalizer, if you will, in terms of access and what that looks like. Dr. Glenda Cox is a senior lecturer at the Center of Innovation in Learning and Teaching at the University of Cape Town. Absolutely. Her portfolio includes a postgraduate in teaching, curriculum change projects, open education, and staff development. She holds the UNESCO Chair in Open Education and Social Justice. She's on the editorial board of the International Journal of Students as partners. She's passionate about the role of open education in changing the world of higher education. Dr. Cox is currently the principal investigator in the Digital Open Textbooks for Development initiative. Her current research includes analyzing the role of open textbooks in social justice. Dr. Glenda Cox, welcome.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Is
it on?
Yes.
Yes, great.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
That was a beautiful segue to come into, firstly unpacking what does open access actually mean?
Great. Okay. Good. Okay, I wanted to start with kind of a general kind of introduction to open textbooks and to openness in more general, so that everyone can kind of understand what these principles are. And essentially make an argument for open education and the role of open education for social justice. And kind of talk about the philosophy of open education, which is around the idea that knowledge is a collective social product and the desirability of making it a social property. So essentially what open materials are materials that are under an open license. So we talk about full copyright on materials, and open licenses like Creative Commons allow the user to use those materials in a particular way. And once you take educational materials and you add an open license, what you have are materials that are converted back into public goods because everybody can use them. And at the moment, there are over 2 billion openly licensed materials out there through Creative Commons. It's quite a big movement that's happening. So what is a digital open textbook? So an open textbook doesn't have to be digital, but they mostly are. And what they do is, so firstly, we had to try and figure out what a definition would be, because it's not your traditional textbook that's between two covers. So we decided that it would be a collection of material that was related to particular content, teaching and learning content, published under open licensed, but also had these great affordances to integrate multimedia, and also be published on different platforms, so that it was not only the case that it's published digitally or perhaps in the learning management system, but that also it could be printed out if necessary, or printed in a form that was kind of an inexpensive or low-cost form. But what we found that was really powerful, and I think this is part of my argument today, is that what creating these open textbooks did was it enabled collaboration and co-authorship in all the different aspects, and actually brought new voices to the creation of these materials. And so we kind of make this argument that it's about the process instead of just the product. So open textbooks is doing a lot more than just saving money, which it certainly is doing, but it also provides an opportunity for different voices and different and local relevant content. So yeah, that's...
Thank you very much for that description. I think perhaps the question on my mind, and perhaps some people in the audience, is around content, or rather product owners that create and develop the content, the educational content that would be placed on an open access platform. What does that mean for regenerative revenue and sustenance for the individuals who are creating what would then be open, you know, for free access? I understand the thinking behind creating a space where accessibility becomes possible and where collaborative energy becomes possible. And I mean, the end user, which is the student, which is someone that's on the receiving end, can absolutely benefit from that. My question is, what happens to the content creator from a sustainability point of view, and them being able to retain and sustain themselves? On the other spectrum of that, does not the opportunity or the ability to access something for free enable complacency from the receiver?
Okay, so two parts. So the idea with open access, so open access more generally in terms of research, is what it's done is it's switched the cost of doing that onto the author. So although the author retains their copyright, if you want to publish an open access journal, you often have to have article publishing costs. Not all models, there are lots of different models of open access publishing. So, and that's kind of brings to point, so why would you do it then? Because you aren't going to make any money out of it at all, right? And, you know, possibly you could have a kind of low-cost model or a model where you were printing out, or you had the book available for sale in some kind of way. Mm-hmm. And it comes down to a couple of things. So first of all, it comes down to a kind of a general passion for the fact that the content that you have should be out there and should be shared and should be available for everyone. And that could be people in Africa, it could be people in South Africa, other connections that you have. So there's definitely something about a passion and an open philosophy that drives this kind of work. And we found we had small implementation grants. We don't anymore. We have no money for that sort of work at the moment. That really helped. So sometimes institutions will help if it becomes a priority. Overseas, for example, in the US, the government has made a lot of money available to create open materials. There are also philanthropic funders who will also help with these things. And so there are lots of different kinds of sort of financial models. But there's not going to be any money made out of it. And one of the arguments in the beginning was, if you want to make put your teaching materials into a book form and sell it as a textbook, you're not really going to make money from that. If you're very famous, then certainly you probably would. And this was an argument that was applied even at MIT, where they looked at the models for making money out of textbooks and realized they weren't going to make money out of textbooks. And in fact, sharing textbooks was going to bring more students in. Mm-hmm. Your second part was a complacency of students, or complacency of...
So generally, that question comes from, sometimes psychologically, when you access something for free, you take it for granted. Now, the mere fact that the person who's created the content placed it on this platform for consumption, for development, and then on the receiving end, the performance of the receiver is not indicative of the quality of the content that has been placed out. What are the measures in place to ensure quality assurance in terms of that? I guess that's essentially what I was asking.
So we're going to the quality aspect. So one of the things that we've done recently with a lot of the open textbooks is encouraged the authors to include students in the work. And I did mention that opportunity for collaboration. But we've seen a really clear pathway with student co-creation. Co-creation and co-creation at authorship level, but also quality assurance. Quite incredible how students have got involved, and feedback. Because the materials are digital, because they can be updated with local examples, local case studies, students can actually be drawn into this work, which is what I was saying about this idea of the process and not the product. This is an incredible opportunity to bring students in, which wouldn't have happened with a more traditional type of textbook that was written by an expert that was couldn't be touched or altered. This is a new pedagogical approach where the learner can actually be brought into these materials. The quality of the materials themselves, we've got, I think, about 47 open textbooks that anyone can use and adapt and change. And we've just found that it's a kind of a pride of authorship. So if you're putting your name on materials, you're going to make sure that they're the best materials that you have, because they're going to be under scrutiny, not from your class anymore, but actually from all kinds of people potentially. So the quality's actually been very high, but we're especially excited by the fact that hopefully we won't have that kind of complacency idea, and we can have more inclusion.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I think at this point, I want to throw it back to our audience. You've heard the perspective of the publisher. You've heard the perspective of someone who supports open access for the betterment of the student, the end user, and also, to encourage and amplify access for quality content. We are also about to layer this conversation with the students' perspective. But before we get into that, I'd like to find out from the audience whether you have any questions, whether you have any commentary in terms of the disposition of the publisher, the disposition of learning and teaching frameworks such as open access, and what they mean in the context of higher education, before we layer the conversation with the students' opinion. Yes, let me do this. Let me offer you a mic. Do we have any questions on Slido or through the Facebook Live? Nothing just as yet. Okay, all right. You can go for it.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Janine and Dr. Cox, for the very insightful information that you guys have given thus far. My question is for Dr. Cox. And another comment, should I say, is that you guys are speaking quite often about access and affordability. What do you feel, as UCT, as the university, the publisher could do better to accommodate access to quality material for your students so that OER doesn't progress as fast as it is right now?
No suggestions. So there are different models of doing this, and one of them is, so there's a no-cost model, which is what I'm suggesting is open textbooks that are freely available, but there's also a low-cost model, which is very prominent in the US, for example. And that's also great for the students because it's materials that are much more affordable. And so I was, interested to hear what Oxford Press is doing around being embedded in the learning management system and bringing in materials that could be accessible for everyone, because that's the dream, right? Is our students walk into the classroom and they all have the material, they have the textbook, because then we know that there's that at least we've got a solid starting point. So those kinds of interventions, I think, for South African students who have already asked for fees must fall, who are very aware that textbooks are so expensive, I think having solutions like that where, it's part of the university's learning management system and so on, so that students can access it would be the way ahead. But I think the place of expensive textbooks is, that is no longer an option. And I think publishers know that, though. It's moving. Does that answer your question?
All right.
Can I come in there for a second? Sorry, I do know that there's another question. So I just wanted to say that I think that absolutely we do need to look at different models because ultimately we all have the student best interest at heart. And that student isn't a static person. It's moving through to the workforce. It's participating in the economy and so on. So we absolutely want to give students the best. I think it's really important that stakeholders work together, though, and I'm not seeing that happening in an agitated way as much as I would like to. So it'd be good to see institutions working with booksellers, working with e-tailers, working with publishers, working more with academics and students. I really appreciate what you were saying about involving the students in the content creation as well.
Alrighty, Tulani or Leo?
Yes, I've got a question for Janine, but in my question, I'll be a bit more biased towards the students because I do sympathize with them. We are dealing with education inequalities in South Africa, and access to learning materials is actually very important because a lot of students are struggling to access, textbooks because they are actually unaffordable for many of them, especially those from, low socioeconomic backgrounds. So my question is, with regard to, you mentioned that there is need for advocacy and awareness because a lot of students are actually, pirating these books without actually knowing, the legal implications of that because this is an infringement of, a copyright, right? Do you think, this is the most effective, strategy to deal with textbook piracy? Or maybe we need much more than that in terms of policy at a national level, including the government, the national government, and rather the Department of Education, to actually come up with a large-scale program to actually make sure that students who are struggling financially to have sort of a leeway to access textbook. I know Dr. Glenda Cox spoke about open access, but I'm not so sure how far the government has gone in terms of supporting open access initiatives, so that students who are struggling to complete their education, partly because of very expensive and inaccessible textbooks, are sort of given sort of a cushion. Yes, so that's my question. Probably it's a question that goes to both of you. Mm-hmm. Yes, thanks.
Ginny, do you want to take?
So as the majority of the people in the room will no doubt know, NSFAS obviously disperses millions of bursaries every year to higher education students that are under where the household income is under a particular threshold. And up until a few years ago, there used to be part of that funding that was ring-fenced for buying textbooks, and that was done away with. And that had a massive impact on publishers, booksellers, and it also kind of opened up the door to illegal activities like piracy, because students then didn't have to spend money on buying textbooks or learning materials. So I'm not sure that government has the answer if they've taken that move. So I think that it's more up to other players in the higher education industry. And I think we need to be looking at stuff like public-private partnerships, getting funding from other sources. I mean, we know funding is an issue, even in the open access arena. I mean, somebody has to pay for the content to be created, commissioned, conceptualized, packaged, distributed, and so on. That doesn't happen for free. Someone is paying for that. Yes, I think I've answered your question, but tell me if I haven't.
You actually answered my question. Thank you so much.
All righty. Thank you, Janine. Dr. Cox?
In terms of government, I know that there is a white paper around open learning, they call it. It's a little different terminology. And so there is some encouragement around that. And they have quite recently built a platform that not many people know about. I have to remember something. National Open Learning System, NOLS it's called, NOLS. I think you have to log in to get into it, which is not technically correct if you want to be really open. But that has a lot of materials, especially for TVET colleges. A lot of open materials and videos in there. So the government is thinking about some sort of segue in some of the areas around trying to give support. But it's a long journey, though. I mean, we know it's a long journey.
Alrighty, so we've heard from both sides of the spectrum in terms of open access and publishers. We've also started to unpack the disposition of the student, of the end user. And it is at this point that I would like to call upon Alton Splinter to join us on stage and share in the context of a student, what their disposition is, what their buying decisions are encouraged by, what the intricate challenges are from a student perspective. Alton, welcome. Alton is a dedicated student pursuing his BA in psychology after successfully completing higher certificate in community counseling from Cornerstone Institute. Demonstrating leadership qualities, Alton is presently in his second term as the treasurer of the SRC, having served as its secretary the previous year. Beyond academia, Alton has a rich entrepreneurial background spanning a decade in mental health care, addiction treatment, and psychiatric transport. With a passion that extends the hobbyist pursuits, he has spent 2 decades as a bookkeeper and jam maker. Quite an enterprising young individual. Alrighty, Alton. From the perspective of a student, talk to us about some real-life examples of students who are struggling to access academic material, what those look like, and essentially, what are some of the drivers in terms of the decision a student makes to pirate academic content?
Okay, thank you so much, Cynthia, and a very warm welcome to everyone here. As you mentioned, My name is Alton. I've been at Cornerstone since 2019, so I'm a slow learner, I think. Should I use it? Okay. Can you hear me better? All right. I've got a loud voice. I thought maybe it wouldn't be necessary. But as I mentioned, I've been at Cornerstone since 2019 doing various courses. And during the last 5 years, I've served as a class representative for numerous modules. As Izzy mentioned, I was elected last year to serve as the Secretary and Treasurer of the SRC, and then re-elected by the student body this year as its Treasurer. And during this term, I've been a representative on a few of the committees at Cornerstone, from marketing to financial aid, to their disciplinary committees, and I've gained strong insights into students' needs and their socioeconomic situations, for which I'm eternally grateful. So in addition to this, I'm also a member of Equal Education, the social movement, with a mandate towards equal education for all South Africans. I need to mention that. So when this critical dialogue did come up, as a student representative addressing textbook piracy, and what we focused on was particularly digital piracy, and not so much physical books. But we've done the following research prior to this dialogue. So firstly, multiple SRC meetings to inquire as to whether textbook piracy is a problem at Cornerstone Institute, and if so, why. We've done informal interviews, which was conducted with a number of students to gain personalized insight into their need to purchase textbooks, any affordable alternatives, and also if they are downloading and distributing digital books within their student circles. An anonymous qualitative survey was circulated as well to all online students across respective WhatsApp groups. And I apologize that the survey was largely localized. It was not distributed among other higher learning institutes, so the sample size wasn't very big. But I'm going to be giving, some of the research on what came out on that survey. And then in addition to this, multiple interviews were conducted with 2 recruitment specialists from different agencies to get a feel for the desperate unemployment crisis, firstly in South Africa, and minimal educational criteria for professional job seekers. And I'll explain very briefly how this relates to textbook piracy, if I may. So before I go into this research, there's something that I do need to tell everyone, that the South African Constitution recognizes education as a fundamental right and not a privilege. Section 29 of the Constitution, Act 108 of 1996, explicitly states, and I quote, that A, everyone has the right to basic education, including adult basic education, and B, to further education, which the state, through reasonable measures, must make progressively available and accessible. This is a mandatory obligation from the government to all its citizens, and it speaks directly to fundamental learning tools like textbooks and research material that students expect to be provided. Okay. Now, the reason for interviewing recruitment specialists was to understand what a basic recognized education in South Africa is. Okay. So, and to understand modern employment trends. Now, what was gleaned was that a matric certificate was not sufficient for professional employment. And I think we probably know that already. And that higher education has become the minimum standard. So what that says is that higher education has become basic education. And as basic education, higher learning textbooks should be provided under the Constitution. Okay, so that is just, in my opening statement, but I'd like to give, the panelists and also the audience and people at home a little bit on what the survey, the research of what came out from the survey. Thanks. And, and I just want to, just to mention that this is with the understanding that Cornerstone Institute is a private higher education institution. So why I mention that is because I would have an understanding that because it's a private higher education, that more privileged students would be afforded to come to Cornerstone. This is the research and what the results showed. So one of the questions was, do you feel that education is a basic human right or privilege in South Africa? 62.5% of the students in the sample felt that it's a basic right, 62%. Have you needed to purchase any textbooks this year, or was course material provided? And 75% of the students in the sample said that they had to purchase textbooks. Then I've asked, have you downloaded or gained free access to digital copies of textbooks? 81% have downloaded textbooks. 81% of the sample. One of the questions was, is the provided online platforms for textbooks, for relevant textbooks, is it sufficient? 81% of the students felt that what was provided was not sufficient for doing the assignments. Are you struggling financially to cover monthly university fees? 68% responded to struggling financially. And do you feel that all course material should be provided, including textbooks? 100% of the sample felt it should be provided. So, that is some of the things that came through, with regards to the survey, just to give everybody a feel of how the students feel. And like I said, it's a small sample, but I'm sure had we done quantitative studies, it might probably show the same results.
All right. Now that was a load of information.
Sorry.
Super jam-packed, but also it offers us multiple dimensions to look at the disposition of the student. So let's talk around affordability. Let's talk around the 81% that downloaded content. Let's talk about what that does to influence the integrity of educational content, whether it positions the student in a favorable position to fully engage their course, their examinations, and all the assessments that needs to come with it, and show up as best as they possibly can intellectually, armed with the right kind of content. We know from a South African context that education is expensive and somewhat inaccessible. What I guess we're trying to understand today is the reasons behind a student going, I would rather pay for my mother's groceries as opposed to buy my 2,000 Rand tax textbook and go and download it. What are the driving forces behind that? And as someone in the SRC, what frameworks do you have within those institutional spaces to field the type of challenges that students have, but not only field them, create innovative tools and spaces to help institutions resolve some of those issues. I understand that there's a call here to support the end user, but there's also an opportunity to be collaborative in how we drive the solution. And perhaps that's the whole point of this evening's conversation. So from the student's perspective, what I hear are a lot of challenges that they are facing. I think I'm keen on hearing what students would want to essentially bring forward as part and parcel of how we start designing solutions.
Thank you, Zizi. Yes, I agree with you. I think, just while you were busy speaking, I was thinking to myself and with the academics that are in the room, in writing an appropriate higher education academic paper does not take one textbook. It takes multiple textbooks and multiple papers from multiple sources. Some of the sources are not in English, and I do know of students that are having papers transcribed into their own language to try and understand it. Some of the answers, that people are giving me, and that I've got the survey in front of me, it's uncanny, to what you've said. But people are saying, does it even exist with books being available download in this digital age? Which means that students are not even seeing it as piracy. They're looking at it as it's available on my computer. I can download it. I'm going to use it. I need to get through my degree. You know, people are saying it is out of depression and lack of finances that students download textbooks. It should be free. Piracy is wrong, but so is poverty. Textbooks were copied in the first place so that everyone has access to them. You know, so the students are kind of, you know, and I mean, I've got it in my closing, but we expected a lot more results, you know, from the survey and from the interviews that we've taken. And what has actually come back, you know, from how small the response has actually been, is that students are not looking at piracy as being a problem. It's not a problem. You know, and if there was obviously more awareness, you know, to that this is a problem, what are we doing about it, then I suppose more people would have responded to the survey, you know, which hasn't really. But I think there are two schools of students, and, you know, the one is obviously the student that cannot afford it, you know, and there are many of them, and that is within Cornerstone and within a lot of universities. But there's another school, and the other school are people that are fighting in light of past atrocities, of apartheid, of colonialism, and the fact that the uneven distribution of resources in this country has been condoned through systemic injustice for hundreds of years. And people are buying into the fact that we have been taken for granted for so long, and that is as far as we're about to go.
Thank you very much, Alton. I think that begs the question for me around how do we start as stakeholders who are affected by textbook piracy, as people who have a common goal to provide content that enables the development and advancement of students? How do we start to unpack and resolve the issues centered around textbook piracy from a publishing perspective, from an open access perspective, from a student perspective, and as of now, from an academic and author perspective? I'd like to call upon Dr. Sean Viljoen to join us on stage. Dr. Viljoen has taught South African and African literature at Cathkin High School, Hewitt College of Education, Wits University, and Stellenbosch University. With a keen interest in queer biography and memoir, he authored Richard Rive, a partial biography at Wits Press in 2013, which was shortlisted for the Alan Paton Prize for Nonfiction in 2014. Currently serving as the Deputy Dean of Education at Cornerstone Institute, Sean is responsible for designing Teachers College undergraduate and postgraduate education courses. He also holds the prestigious title of Emeritus Associate Professor in the English Department at Stellenbosch University. Dr. Viljoen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Zizi.
Sean, my first question to you is, as someone as invested in education and the quality of delivery in terms of the subject matter and the content, what is your disposition when it comes to students accessing content that may be outdated, that inadvertently affects the quality of how they then engage examinations, grading, assessments, and essentially negatively influence the process of readying them for a live environment that requires hardcore skill?
Thank you, Zizi. Hello, everybody. Zizi, I'm just going to latch on to one word in your question, in your very nuanced question, and about disposition. So, thinking about this topic of, I've extended it in my own mind, not to textbook piracy, but book piracy generally in higher education. And, to this question, I think I bring a particular disposition. And that disposition comes from I think, two sources. One is my own experience of being a student at UCT in the mid-70s, just prior to that seismic 1976 and afterwards, with a group of us being affiliated with struggle organizations and finding it imperative that one of the things we did, besides all the other kinds of support actions, was to read. To read, and make sense of the world. And some of the reading came from our political elders, our mentors, who had good libraries, and we'd pass the book around, mostly Marxist literature, but not only that, it was also world literature, what we then called literature of commitment. And more often than not, the thing we did to feed our reading and circulate was to photocopy books relentlessly. And we had one of our, we didn't call ourselves comrades then, one of our fellow activists, and we didn't call ourselves activists then, he was the king of photocopying, and these were school photocopies or business. The photocopy became a machine for our war against racial oppression and capitalism. There was no question of pirating, there's no question of copyright. The sense was that the end justified the means. And I think I've come to this question still colored by that, because we've won the war against formalized racism, but institutionalized systemic racism is as alive and well. But above all, the gap in this country and in the world between rich and poor is growing enormously. It's the few who manage to garner obscene wealth, and the poor here and elsewhere who are just on the edge of survival. I mean, many of us in this room as lower middle class professionals are feeling it as well in the way the world is going. We've been driven back into what the struggle rhetoric called the loins of the working class. So, Zizi, that is colored by attitude. And secondly, it's the way we got to see the world, which is, related to that kind of sense, best captured in the woolly idea of John Lennon's Imagine. Imagine all the people living life in peace, imagine all the people sharing all the world. So in some senses, it's come into the open philosophy in a very, very different kind of way. But it's a sense that actually, to realize what we really want to do, equal education for all, access to education and books, we really need to make radical changes in the world.
Thank you very much, Saul. And I think that enables us to segue to an important aspect, or rather a concerning aspect of the impacts of textbook piracy in the context of education, and that's around localized content. So not being able to drive revenue to sustain the textbook production market, the publishing market, poses a threat to local content creators, that offer context in terms of the learning materials that are utilized for the purposes of teaching in higher education. What are your thoughts on the extremities of that as a risk?
Zizi, there was something that Alton mentioned, one of the students said in response to the survey. Piracy is wrong, but so is poverty. To me, there's no right and wrong in the way we look at piracy. I think some, as Alton says, some students are, just driven to pirate books. And Alton, I think correctly, many of our cornerstone students are struggling, but, could afford to buy books. But there's some who are really desperately poor. I would just like to read an email from one of the students I got just a few days ago, just to indicate that there are very many of Cornerstone Institute students who are really desperate. This is a student, she lives in the deep rural Northern Cape, and she writes, I've been experiencing a lot of problems since after registering. I lost my job and I have not any other financial aid. I didn't have a laptop to do my assignments and a smartphone. Had I known this would happen, I wouldn't have registered. Only after registering, I started experiencing problems like this. I stay in a village in Taung, far from town and libraries. I was only able to borrow a laptop from my friend this weekend to use for my assignments. So, again, to me, seeing the situation of students, I don't condone textbook piracy. As an author myself, I know what that means, and I then would talk to students about the legal and ethical dimensions of textbooks piracy. But if they continue to do it, they will do it. And my approach is, I'm actually more concerned with the way they using AI to generate answers that are not their own. That for me is my big dilemma. How do we deal with that at the moment? So, I'm sorry, Janine, but I'm afraid textbook piracy is not a primary concern of mine as an academic.
All right, so I think at this point in time, we've got a couple of questions via Slido for the panelists. So I'm going to head on over to the screen, and we can start working through some of those questions. And as we do that, for us to start thinking about what do the solutions look like, and who do we need in the room to kickstart those conversations, streamline more progressive ways of opening up access, and what that looks like for all the stakeholders affected, more specifically the end user. All right, let's do this. Anonymous number 1. A follow-up on the previous question. Are there any incentives by publishers and institutions to have authors choose PDFs over hard copy textbooks? I think that's for you, Janine.
Sorry, I just want to read the question there.
Are there any incentives by publishers and institutions to have authors choose PDFs over hard copy textbooks?
I'm just wondering if that's have authors choose PDFs or have lecturers choose PDFs.
Let's assume that it's authors or lecturers. I don't know. It depends how you'd like
lecturers,
to.
Yeah, so I can't see why authors would choose PDFs. I think from an incentive perspective, creating EPUBs as opposed to PDFs.
Yeah.
I'm going to differentiate between an EPUB and a PDF as well. Okay. So all of Oxford University Press's higher education books are available as EPUBs, and we sell them widely. And there's a slight cost benefit. So EPUBs are generally cheaper than print copies. And it's also much easier to deliver those EPUBs and digital content to institutions. It's much easier for publishers to negotiate direct deals with institutions to deliver those EPUBs to every student in the class. So you can make sure that everyone has access, and it kind of equalizes that in a sense. In terms of a PDF, so publishers, to the best of my knowledge, would not share a PDF because that's exactly the problem. That's what's getting shared on WhatsApp and Telegram and so on. And it's not a paid for, and when I say paid for, it doesn't have to be the end user, it can be the institution, it could be a bursary, there's a variety of ways that could be paid for, yeah.
Alrighty. Yes.
If I can ask Janine, what is an EPUB?
So an e-book, as opposed to just a PDF, which is an electronic file.
Okay. Anonymous number 2. How do we compel government to take more action to support open learning and open access? Dr. Cox, I think that one is for you.
That's a difficult question to answer. I wish I had the answer. I think there are lots of initiatives. In my capacity as UNESCO chair, we're trying to get the other UNESCO chairs in South Africa who are interested in this work to do research that can inform policy. But there definitely is, and I mean, I think Janine was also saying this, and you know, we work in these silos often, where it's kind of public universities and private universities and publishers and the government, and it's very hard to work across those spaces. So I think research to inform that policy, to really make good cases for why it's so important to be extending open learning.
Sorry, I just want to respond to that, because I really like what you're saying about the fact that we are all working in silos. And it is difficult to bridge the gap. I think often we think that our sectors or our mandates are mutually exclusive, but they're actually not. I mean, the whole issue is to work with all the stakeholders and to find solutions which work for everybody. There's a lot of interplay between all of the stakeholders as well. Everyone is contributing. I mean, I'd like to make the point that I think often publishers are seen as just being commercial, but one must also remember that the majority of publishers give back to the academic sector as well through a host of activities. We sponsor conferences, we drive thought leadership, we make sure that pedagogy is embedded in learning materials. So it's not just about selling a book.
Understood. Anonymous number 3. Actually, someone please move up for me. Move up, move up, move up, move up, move up again. Okay, my understanding is the printing cost more than creating PDFs. What are the different cost margins, if any, on what an author makes on a hard copy versus a licensed PDF?
Sure. So I'm going to try and answer that question as I'm interpreting it. So obviously there are costs involved with printing as opposed to an EPUB, but even in EPUB there's distribution costs as well. E-tailers charge fees to host those files and to distribute them and so on. So it's cheaper, but it's not free. And then what are the different cost margins on what an author makes? So that question literally depends on the contract the author has with the publisher, whether it's royalty-based, whether it's fee-based. So that would absolutely differ from project to project.
Alrighty, I think that concludes it in terms of the Q&As from Slido. Do we have any questions in the audience? Yes, ma'am, and then Tulani.
Hi there. Thank you for the engaging conversation. It was very interesting. I'm from Rothko, a PR organization that deals with a lot of education sector clients. Earlier on, I think Dr. Cox, you spoke about collaboration, a whole lot of collaboration and bringing or creating, content for Africa by Africa. So getting students and other collaborators to be included in the generating of the copy or the content itself, specifically for open access. Well, my question is, what is being done, or are there ways to get those open access publications out to the global north, as opposed to it just being relevant for Africa in Africa? Is there a way to incentivize these case studies that are, homegrown, so that we are feeding into, the global narrative, as opposed to what I tend to see in textbooks that are more Western-based? They will have a lot of Western case studies that, are not relevant for us Africans, and yet that's what is used to teach in the classroom. The more we have, local case studies, that's very well and great locally, but how can we get those case studies feeded back into the global market so that we're telling our own stories from that perspective? Thanks.
Thank you very much for the question. So we find a lot of these resources are in repositories. So we've got an open UCT repository. So the UCT textbooks and other materials are all there and anyone can access them. You don't have to log in or anything. You just go in and you can, there's a Creative Commons license on it and you can use it from there. So, and what a repository does is it has metadata. So if you search in Google, wherever you are in the world, if you're looking for materials, let's say on virology, so top whatever example, we have materials on virology, but we also have localized issues and solutions and work from professors that specific cases in South Africa and so on. And it's very interesting that the downloads are still predominantly from the north, and like India and the UK, and so our materials are getting out there, and that's definitely a big priority around this work, is to actually look at that. And it's been very interesting to see the downloads are actually global. So that's a good thing.
Can I respond to that as well from a publishing perspective?
Sure.
So that's a really good question that you asked. And I think that's one of the competitive advantages which South African publishers have, is we are publishing for the local market. We are using local authors who are academics and lecturers to really embed Africanized pedagogies, theories, and kind of put that at the forefront, and not just to respond to what's happening in the global north. So the fact is that we are creating local content, and that's gives us a huge advantage in the market.
Are you happy? Okay, all right. Next question. Karen had her hand up. Can we pass the mic?
Thanks so much, Zizi. So my question is around the funding model, because my understanding is that actually the government has never ever spent as much money on funding higher education than they do now. I mean, the government provides, thousands and thousands of NSFAS bursaries every single year. And as part of that bursary, they are actually supplying the students with money for textbooks. So, I mean, I think the problem that we've been talking about is that there's a funding problem, whether it's to fund the creation of open access material or whether it's to fund the creation of commercial material. Isn't the problem that the funding that is being made available is actually not going to the correct source? Is that something that maybe your panelists can comment on?
Sean, your thoughts?
I think that's part of the problem. But I wonder if the problem isn't bigger than that. I think we're losing a culture of reading and a respect for books. I know there's a lot of reading that goes on in different forms these days. But, I still think there is huge value in trying to reignite, and there are many organizations doing this at school level, reignite this culture of reading and respect for books. I'm horrified. Libraries, for example, could play in communities a huge role in this. But Khayelitsha has been shut now for days because of cable theft. Menenberg Library shut because of gang fights around it. I mean, we really... What can we do, both as teacher educators, as teachers in our schools, as publishers, to foment again a culture of reading and respect for books? One of my problems with, prescribing a textbook for a course is that, again, I think Alton mentioned this, we need multiple perspectives on any kind of subject. That's part of the pedagogical approach. And part of that too, we'd like students to actually, despite their 100% not wanting to buy, we'd like them to buy books. Especially in teacher education, teachers need to have their own library, and they need to model reading. And above all, my concern is with the homes. I mean, reading culture begins at a very young age in homes, in the early school years. So, what can we do to, in these very broken homes we live with in the country, what can we do as individuals, organizations, to intervene in fomenting this reading culture? Above lobbying for more funding and a better kind of spending patterns in education.
Yes.
Just very quickly. Hi, good evening. Thanks, ma'am, for your question. You know, while he was speaking, I had an interview with a student that is getting a bursary. And, you know, just on one point that you mentioned, the money that is allocated for textbooks, it's not monitored. It's not monitored, you know, so a student would rather spend that money on something else if they could get the book, you know. So just to answer that, maybe people that are supplying bursaries better look at where that money is going, you know, and if a certain amount is allocated for textbooks, then the receipts should be sent through. These are the books that I've purchased, and you know what I mean, from that point forward. Thank you.
I'd like to layer your comment because I agree. I think you're absolutely right. Reassignment of those funding opportunities is of paramount importance. But what do we need to do to get that right? And it goes back to educational institutions, publishers, authors, coming into one space and collaborating and working as a collective. So maybe the question is, what frameworks do we need to build and design in order for there to be a direct pathway that deals with exactly that, misappropriation of funds that are meant to be going to accessing academic content?
So I wanted to refer to something that Elton was saying earlier about the survey that you did. So, I mean, we've also done our own research, and it absolutely, even though your sample size was small, it resonates with what the research that we've done as well. And I think looking at how the money allocation or the textbook allocation is spent is really key. I mean, we'd love to see versus government, be it NSFAS or other models or entities or funding, to really closely manage how that funding is being spent, because it's clearly given for a specific purpose. Mm-hmm. So we do need some monitoring, like you say, around that.
Thank you very much, Janine. You can, and then I need the mic to go to Tulani.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you. So I first of all need to apologize. I didn't introduce myself earlier. My name is Nasir Abrams, and I'm from a company named Perego. Piracy is actually a $20 billion business in the world. In South Africa, NSFAS gives students 5,200 Rand per annum to buy them books. 3 years ago, NSFAS took the stance to say students are responsible enough to manage the money themselves. Now, you're getting a student from a rural area that has never had that much money in his hand. Mm-hmm. What is he going to do? He's going to send it home to his parents because his parents needs the money. The student, a true life example, Nelson Mandela University, 3 years ago when that change happened, TOPS in Port Elizabeth made more than 1 million Rand in profit on alcohol. Why? You're giving a 19, 18-year-old 5 grand to do what with? Now, I'm not here to sell my product at all. I have the solution, but I'm adding on to say that the solution is at home. Kids need to learn from home to read. But because we don't have that reading culture, we've got a literacy issue in South Africa and in Africa.
Absolutely.
So access over ownership is what students want. Everything is changing. Music has changed. Movies has changed. Do you go to your friends and ask for the USB with movies? No. Netflix, Showmax, Spotify. Nasir Abrams Perego, go have a look at it. That's your solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tulani, before you go for it, how are we doing for time? Koketso? Alrighty. Tulani, go for it.
Thanks. My name is Tulani Dube. I am a Cornerstonian. Is that correct? I think the issue is a very multifaceted issue. I think just from the use of or monitoring of funds, there arises a very one-sided conversation because that can be looked at from a level of privilege. If we look at the poverty levels,
Yeah.
and that's something that's known, and we know where this money is going to go to, and I understand 1 or 2 kids is going to blow it on shoes, but statistically, over 70% of the population is living below the poverty line, basically. So that money is going home. But firstly, I would like to commend, I have to say, during the period of, I think, 2017 to about 2020, I managed to move the entire business studies department at that time to Oxford Press. Solely because and I'm talking prescribed and recommended readings, solely because of the content, the way it was structured, and the way it speaks to localized case studies. So I wanted to put that out there before I start the criticism. I think my question then becomes an issue of education is a business. So is publishing. And that puts the student in a really difficult position between 2 market forces that claim to be standing up for the student. So maybe my first question then becomes to the publishers. How can you integrate or how can you balance the 2 in terms of who you are trying to sell the product to, as opposed to who the authors, because ultimately they need to get paid. That is your client. And it then may be difficult to look out to the needs of both, so I'll put it that way. And then also in terms of the open access, do you guys work together? Because obviously publishers create these inroads in departments so that HODs can prescribe books. And the minute you get more books prescribed, more books recommended, that's where the sales is generated. Is there an alignment with what the open source looks like in terms of content? Because if those are not aligned, there's no need or no reason for a student to be there in the first place. So I think alignment, that's my question of alignment. I think I'll end it there, otherwise I will hog the mic. I actually wrote down quite a lot. So.
Thanks, Tulani. I'm really pleased that you're using Oxford University Press books.
I moved.
Wanted to buckle my seatbelt when I heard that there was criticism coming. I think that what you're saying about education and publishing is the student is caught in the middle of essentially 2 quite volatile and challenging sectors or industries. Both have their challenges, and there's a lot of overlap over there. What you're saying, though, about, we've heard about a culture of reading and giving back and so on. And I think perhaps, I alluded to this earlier about publishers also giving back a lot, and our role in the higher education sector. But there's other initiatives which publishers are able to do. So publishers, obviously, we want everybody to read, and that starts right at the beginning. So, as much as we are Oxford University Press, and I'm here talking with a higher education hat on, we publish reading series and phonics and literacy from the beginning, and we work with a lot of other companies, such as we currently have a AVBOB campaign, which is the Road to Literacy. So we really are kind of trying to change this culture of reading, but to also understand that there's an appreciation for books. And the only way that we can kind of give back to the communities and so on is, that's offset by actually also being commercially viable company, as it were. And from the higher education perspective, I must mention that we're super proud of the fact that we have a partnership with the Mandela Rhodes Foundation. So the Mandela Rhodes Foundation is a shareholder of 25.1%. So a lot of our dividends are reinvested into African scholars on the continent, and that's something that we're really proud of. And we've given scholarships to hundreds of students already. So we really are quite committed to, from the little ones right through their basic education and beyond, to kind of getting them, to positioning them to have the best chance, as it were.
Sean, you want to respond as well?
I've got something different I want to ask the publishers.
Okay. Now's the time.
Okay, now's the time. We at Cornerstone we've got 2 postgraduate certificates in education at the lower primary and the upper primary, and we've got almost 1,000 students in there. So classes could be 500 strong. They do their modules, and I've looked at the prescribed reading for all the modules. And only in one module of the very, very many bitty modules they do and then go and be a teacher is educational psychology that happens to use an Oxford University text as the textbook for that module. But it struck me that for the rest, they leave this postgraduate certificate in teacher training not having read a book. They're reading bits of things. They're reading articles. They're reading blogs. So my sense is, can't we create across the PGCEs key texts for the year, and all of them have to read 3 or 4 books for the year that are really talking to their South African context, makes them think of the context globally. So one of the books which was recommended to us by a panel of experts that reviewed our PGCs was this one, Becoming a Teacher. It's a Pearson publication. And we've looked at it. It's a really nice book for becoming a teacher, and it's based on reflective practice, which we find very alluring to use it to work with the students. It costs 500 Rand online. Our library at Cornerstone, this is one of the challenges we face, have, according to our librarian, 3 e-books for education that are only available to the lecturers. Now, how can we, this is a question, how can we increase the capacity of our library that students can also access e-books more freely? But on this one, how can we collaborate with publishers to get those 4 or 5 key texts to students at a much cheaper rate? So what I know UNISA did with this book, and I don't know if UNISA operates anymore on a postgraduate certificate of education, they got the lecturers to say which bits they really, really want to use. They had a UNISA reduced edition, and it was sold to the students for 125 Rand. Which, is an option. So the students are not saying, I paid 500 Rand and I didn't only use the 10th of the book. It's the downside is you want teachers to read the whole book, even if we're only using a bit, because you go back and back again to useful books in your library. But really my question, Zizi, is there a way we can collaborate, librarian, lecturers, publishers, in making books, e-books, books available more cheaply to our students?
Yes.
Jenny?
Lovely. Yes, there is. No, I mean, I think that's part of the dialogue that we're having tonight. Is if more stakeholders can work together, we can come up with more reasonable business models for the student. So, if an institution, be it Cornerstone or UNISA, and I know the 125 Rand book that you're talking about, if an institution can work together with the publisher, we will always find a solution which works for everybody. So the model that you're talking about at UNISA is a custom publication, which we are absolutely 100% open to doing, particularly if an institution then can commit to distributing it to all of their students, because then we know that it's a worthwhile initiative. We know that it's affordable. We know that every student gets it. I mean, the offset of that is that you began with talking about the fact that you actually want students to read more. You want them to read more widely. And I don't think that any publisher is going to disagree with you on that. But I think that the principle of the matter is publishers will always work with institutions to find an option that works.
Thank you. Thanks. I like what you had to say. Sean, there's just something that I want to bring up. I was with Cornerstone prior to COVID-19, to bring that up. And I think, and obviously I'd like, authors to speak into that, is the landscape of learning has changed almost irreversibly as a result of COVID, where people were interacting more. On campus, we were sharing physical books. You can have it, but I want it back on Tuesday. I need it, kind of thing, to students. And what has happened in a lot of my circles as well is people started going digital as a result of the lockdown. So, and the browsers fell in line. So with your computer browser, you can highlight things, you can add certain chapters, you can punch in keywords. It has become so easy to research a book, a full book, using your computer as opposed to highlighting and underlining in pencil like we used to do. In the old days, and of course we want students to read more. But just what I have seen, and this is just in Cornerstone. Cornerstone has a great library, and I spent many days, in our library when we were still in Cape Town, on the foreshore. I needed to do an assignment. I wasn't prepared to buy a book. I could find it in the library. And I would sit and I'd make notes and I would write, and it was actually a nice time to actually just write. And then COVID happened, and the majority of our students went online. And I don't think, too sad to say this, that we have actually caught up yet with regards to a digital library. And it came through in some of the responses from the students of, isn't there a digital library? I can't make my way to Milnerton. I'm here, I'm studying online. What is Cornerstone doing? And it's just a general feel, that I've been getting. And as a student, and it's unfortunate, but we share information. All the time. It's like I read something important. The first thing is, let me phone this one will like this, and I'm sharing information, and it feels almost like an obligation to let somebody know, I've read this article, this is incredible, you must read it, send it to me, and it's part of piracy. Yes, I agree. But it's happening, the sharing of information. It's gone from a physical book into a digital format mainly, and I think it's, and I'd like to obviously hear, what's happened with regards to people buying physical books as opposed to digital books, and online books.
Is that a question, Dr. Cox?
Yeah, I think just to kind of add to this conversation, I really appreciate this need to read. But one of the key things that I think students don't understand, and a lot of educators and people don't understand copyright. And they don't understand what it means. And so students don't necessarily realize that they are doing something illegal. Often they do, but often they don't. And there's a big debate around full copyright and open licenses. And traditional copyright with full rights reserved so that it cannot be reproduced, you have to ask permission before you can use it, etc., etc. Obviously, education has some special rights around that, was designed for physical books 100 odd years ago. That was what it was designed, and that was a much easier thing to control. Obviously, copyright for ideas, there are lots of other things, but we're talking about books at the moment. And that was easier to do. But with the internet, with the digital being enabled, what happens is it is so easy to access material and access interesting stuff, whatever. And what people don't realize is everything that is put onto the internet, if you don't specify copyright or or anything, if you say nothing, you just put it up there, it is under full copyright. And people don't always understand. Once you put something on the internet, it's under full copyright. And that's why we've been arguing for alternatives to that traditional copyright that enable the user to use those materials legally. And that's the point with open access and open access materials and open textbooks. They are licensed openly. so the student can download them and can share them and can do whatever, depending on the requirements of the license, can do all kinds of things with those materials. And that comes down to digital literacy that we need to help our students with. So understanding copyright, plagiarism, it's all embedded in this idea of digital literacy. And the world is moving so fast that we haven't been able to keep up with that. And the newest thing is AI. So students and we need to have digital critical AI literacy. So we need to be able to understand what we're doing with all of this work. So I think this kind of academic integrity is something that we need to help with education, and publishers can help, student leaders can help, educators can help to try and help students to understand what it is that's happening, understand how they're infringing copyright, but also understand their own copyright. You know, how do you want to give that copyright away? Do you want to keep that copyright? And understanding these kinds of things in the digital world is complicated but very important.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that you've said now, and it kind of sums things up for me a little bit. So Zizi's asked us to think about solutions and strategies, and for me it falls under two umbrellas, if you will. The first one is education around digital literacy, as you call it. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm amazed when I get emails from lecturers asking me to email them a PDF of our book. They just have no concept of the fact that that's not how it's done. And they don't know what copyright is and so on. And then the second one is collaboration. Mm-hmm. We really have to find different ways of making this work. And I was quite interested in what you were saying earlier. Your survey said that 100% of students felt like their course material should be included. Mm. So that for me is a massive opportunity over here which needs to be harnessed. So if that's what students are wanting, then we need to find ways to make that work. And that's definitely not just a cornerstone
matter.
Thing. No.
All right. Thank you very much. We've heard quite a lot tonight. And to reiterate what Tulani had said earlier on, the surrounding issues around textbook piracy are multi-layered and somewhat generational. I want to come back to your point, Sean, about cultivating spaces within homes for reading. If we look at the current stats in terms of our kids who are able to read for understanding in South Africa right now, it is catastrophic. In a couple of years, those kids become eligible to access higher education or become of age to access higher education. Now, with that current kind of stat, what you are looking at on top of pirated content, on top of diluted content, on top of running the risk of educational content that does not carry integrity, you're looking at a situation that exacerbates for the next generation or for the incoming in terms of access to higher education. So over and above thinking about solutions around how we resolve and engage each other now as different stakeholders within the ecosystem, part and parcel of that needs to carry a long-term goal that then addresses that. For example, in your institution currently, you've got the AFBOB literacy campaign and multiple other initiatives that aim at introducing reading for meaning in quintile 3 schools and such. That needs to happen across the board because ultimately those are our customers 15 years from now as an academic institution. And the layover of diluted lack of context, diluted ability to read, and then having students come in and access a space where piracy is something that is pervasive poses as a risk for us as an institution, for our throughput rates, for academic institutions across the board. So I'd like to take a 10-minute breather. You guys can get up, get yourself a drink, come back, refresh, and let's talk about what solutions look like in terms of us being collaborative, in terms of us curbing some of what is presented by piracy, and the ways in which we can start quite intentionally engaging each other for the purposes of changing the narrative here. So we've reached close to the end of our dialogue, and I'd just like to take this opportunity to just have closing comments from our panelists in terms of what Resolve looks like, what collaboration going forward looks like, and how do we engage to somewhat start to build solutions that combat the issue of textbook piracy. And perhaps maybe let me start with you, Janine.
Sure. I think that, as I mentioned earlier, there's two key focus areas for me. One is around education, and that involves working with institutions to educate students around the fact that piracy is a criminal activity and that you are basically stealing someone's intellectual property. And as Glenda alluded to earlier, I think it could be part of a broader digital literacy conversation because it's not just students, it's also lecturers and academics. The second part is collaboration. So as I mentioned as well, I think it's really important that stakeholders work together. It's very clear from Alton's research and from our research at Oxford University Press that students are desperate for material. They want it, but they also want it to be included in their student fees. Sure. So I would like to see us working with institutions, working with other partnerships, perhaps in other industries as well, to find some solutions where we can make sure that we are working with an institution, with a lecturer, that they have content which is readily available to their students through an LMS integration. And that also ensures that every student has access to content. And it also gives us some leeway to make sure that it's more affordable as well.
Thank you very much. Dr. Cox, your closing remarks?
So obviously my view is different, and my view is that we shouldn't be paying for textbooks, and that students need to have these materials openly available. And that, yeah, if you are publishing in a journal or are you publishing a book through publishers, you're giving away your copyright, in fact, to the publisher. And these are things that we need to be very aware of. We have knowledge and expertise that if we choose it to be freely available, we should be able to do that. And I'm glad to hear Oxford University Press is very flexible in finding solutions, but I have a lot of stories of authors going back to publishers and saying, look, I wrote this textbook on ortholaryngology, but I want to make it open to all people, because I feel that, especially in African institutions, we need that expertise. And the publishers turned around and said, no, sorry, can't do it, not doing that. And so he wrote his own textbook. And so so publishers aren't always that accommodating. And there are incredible materials that are openly available that can be adapted and reused. And speaking, I know you're from a whole lot of different areas. It's not like you're all cornerstone lecturers, and so I'm not speaking to kind of higher education audience. I know this. But I just wanted to share just one of the examples as maybe a possible inspiration. One of the authors at UCT in architecture who created an open textbook. And these are kind of from an interview with her, where she said that it was very important for her in her open textbook development process to bring in female and black voices in a very direct attempt at shifting existing power dynamics, with the hope that this would empower students to have a voice, to contribute to the canon in their field and realize the power in publication. She also expressed how she was using the open textbook as a process through which to change her approach to her course and include persons' own embodied experiences and their lived realities. All of the open textbook authors in the study recognized political misrepresentation and their participation in unjust social arrangements, and responded to these injustices through intuitive pedagogical approaches, advancing just ways of teaching and just ways of selecting and producing content in their open textbook. So I'd like to leave this as a word of encouragement, and that you should be thinking about creating your own materials, sharing your own materials, openly licensing them, and making them freely available for your students.
Thank you. Sean?
Just 3 short points. One, returning to my kind of initial point is, you know, how can we, as a flip side to piracy and theft of ideas, how can we more broadly in society, you know, encourage a complete opposite of that, which is a respect for books. Books are the material embodiment of someone else's voice. So you're dealing with someone else. So, you know, this continual engagement with the ethics of who we are in the world. And it's linked to a larger set of ethical questions that in this kind of very hostile world we increasingly have to ask of our students. So, you know, it's education, education, education. Let me just combine the last two. Well, the second one is cornerstone. I really think our library needs to do more together with our staff and consulting the students as to just how can we jack up our library to make more e-books available to students, to feed into their work. And lastly, out of tonight, I'd be very happy if a very concrete collaboration arose where we think of even one book we're going to do jointly with Oxford or publishers, where we can make it available to students both as an e-book and a hard copy very cheaply, and a book that as academics we find a way that we can get them to engage with it, read it, engage with it, write about it, talk about it. So, you know, that would be my, I suppose, more concrete outcome of tonight.
Thank you very much. Alton? This is in closing.
Thank you. Thanks, Izzy. Yes, I really enjoyed, you know, this evening's discussion, and obviously everything that I say is rooted in a student body that is behind me. They may not be in the hall, but I have constant contact with loads of our students every step of the way. So from my side, and I'm just reading, you know, into my last question of the survey, do you have any suggestions to reduce textbook piracy in higher education? And some of the things, I mean, a lot of students are saying no. It's a sentence, no is a sentence, you know, which speaks volumes. But for the people that have spoken have said universities should make an open source library available, if need be. Add a fee, if need be, to the year tuition, but make this work for us. Providing material and a guide where legal or right material can be found. I think every student must be provided with the books relevant to the modules that they're doing. And perhaps the Institute can create a good relationship with publishers, and students can receive e-books at a discounted rate. So that is just some of the things, you know, that students are saying. And then, you know, in closing, and what I'd like to, you know, mention is that I do sympathize with authors, with contributors, and with publishing houses, and I agree that they should be remunerated for their work, research, and textbook production. I agree with that. However, and I reiterate my point that I made earlier on that wasn't spoken much into, that in light of centuries of segregation under colonialism and apartheid and the grossly uneven distribution of resources that South Africans were subjected to, I'm in agreement that relevant and current higher learning textbooks should be largely freely accessible so that disadvantaged students have full access to the books, and that higher learning institutions, in collaboration with publishing houses and the Department of Education, have a responsibility to both the Constitution of South Africa and the many millions of disadvantaged South Africans to rectify segregation in education by making relevant textbooks free and not to seek or expect remuneration for books from previously disadvantaged students. It is for that reason that out of a survey that was sent to hundreds of students, only a handful felt it even necessary to speak into textbook piracy. Thank you so much.
Well, there you have it, folks. It has been quite an evening. We've heard multiple insights, multiple viewpoints. We have a lot to think about, but more importantly, we ought to be more intentional about how we collaborate, about how we engage, and essentially kickstart the journey to finding solutions to combating textbook piracy. I'd like to thank Dr. Viljoen, Dr. Cox, Janine, and Elton for hearing the call and accepting the invitation to participate in this dialogue, and being here and, fielding the questions and really just engaging in the conversation with intent and with sincerity. Everybody here who's made the time to come and engage, who's fielded questions, who've sat here with interest, who've also just, offered opinions that are meaningful, insights that are meaningful, and that hopefully stimulate the continuation of this significant dialogue. And to express our thank you, in partnership with Oxford University Press, we have some tokens of appreciation to give to you for your enjoyment. Thank you very much for coming out and participating tonight. Go get some. Your favorite thing. Alrighty. Thank you, everybody. That sums it up.